going to go ahead and hand it over to Mr. Ron Weissman. If you guys want to give him a round of applause via your reactions and everything. That's wonderful. Yeah, or a video.
Why don't I kick it off by introducing Ron? I've been honored to get to know Ron in the past. I guess we met about 2 years ago or so. Ron heads up the software group for the Band of Angels, which is the granddaddy of all angel groups in the US, or certainly one of the granddaddies, and is the genesis of a lot of the venture capital community in the US. In fact, kind of archetyped the way technology investing gets done. So it is a very revered group of technology investors. Having said that, Ron himself has probably about the single most interesting personal background, professional background of anybody I've met in my life. And so just to kind of kick it off, Ron started off by getting his PhD at UC Berkeley in history, but also quantitative anthropology. So there's not, I will guarantee all of you, there's not too many people that you will ever meet that have PhDs in quantitative anthropology. However, at this point, some of you are kind of sitting back thinking, it's like, wait, I thought you said that Ron's in the tech industry. It's like, that's what makes his background super interesting. So he's led this incredible arc of a career where he went from a PhD at Berkeley to becoming involved for much of his career in academia in all sorts of various roles, ranging from Berkeley through UPenn, et cetera. But somehow in all of this, arcs over into the tech community, in which he became a partner of Steve Jobs after Steve Jobs' original departure from Apple. So that's a part of history that probably most of you are too young to remember, but there was a time that Steve Jobs, having founded Apple, was also fired from Apple. And he left Apple to go start a company by the name of Next Computer. So from there, Ron wound up in the venture capital and private equity business, becoming a partner in the ninth largest private equity firm in the industry, and then becoming the software special interest group head for the Band of Angels, and extremely connected in the technology angel investment community nationally. In fact, he sits on the board of the American Capital Association, Angel Capital Association, which is the national organization for technology investing. But what we wanted to do here in this talk, and the most relevant, is that for many of you, you guys are very early in your careers, but I've already talked to a number of you individually, one-on-one, et cetera, have come to see a lot of the passion you guys have, especially with regards to social impact entrepreneurism. So what we're using is, this is an opportunity for Ron to talk to you guys about entrepreneurism, what it means to start a company and do it in a colorful way, because, you know, Steve Jobs at some level rose from being a founder of a technology company to being a cultural and otherwise international icon. So with that, let me turn it over to Ron, and once again, virtual round of applause for Ron, one of the most interesting people I will ever meet. Thank you.
Armando, thank you. What this tells me is you need to get out more and meet more people.
I've been told that before.
So it's a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to go into a presentation I wrote pretty much last night for this group, talking about what I learned from Steve, primarily around things like entrepreneurship and technology. So with no further ado, Can you see this all right? Everybody can see the screen?
Yes.
Great. Okay. I'm going to describe what I saw and what many millions of people saw on October 6th, 2011. Steve had died the night before on October 5th. And at the hundreds of Apple stores around the world, and today there are 500 of them, you saw the stores covered with stickies with memories of Steve and wishes for Steve's, ascent to wherever he was going next. And the technology community was stricken with grief. This is one day after Steve died. So he made an amazing impression on just hundreds of millions of people. He was, in my view, Silicon Valley's first rock star. Yes, you've heard of probably the founders of Intel and maybe the founders of Adobe, and everybody knows Bill Gates. But none of these people were rock stars. None of these people were featured on the cover of Rolling Stone. None of these people had fan bases. None of these people had celebrities following them around, or caring who Steve Jobs dated. After his things like crush on Linda Ronstadt, and his favorite magazine, People magazine. Steve always bought a copy of People magazine at every airport he visited. But it was something Silicon Valley needed, a cultural hero, not just a technology hero. And we're going to talk a little bit about this. So when you think of Steve Jobs, you're thinking of somebody who's much, much bigger than life. I had met Steve in the early 80s. I began running university computing for some universities, transitioning from my role as a medieval historian who needed to use computing to get my own research done, into somebody who the university said, hey, you're not a physicist or an engineer. You can be neutral in the computer wars. We'll put you in charge. So I started serving on advisory boards, and I met Steve when he was still at Apple. And then when he left Apple, he asked a number of us to become advisors to his new company, Next, which I did for 5 years, running his advisory board. And then we got into a big, nasty fight. And he said, if you think things are so screwed up here, why don't you come join me? So on January 2nd, 1990, I left the university and joined Steve for the next 5 years. We stayed in touch pretty much up until his death. I was not Steve Jobs' right-hand man. I was running marketing. I was close to Steve. We were good friends. But Steve had lots of right-hand people, some of which we'll probably talk about. So again, Steve was, among other things, the technology world's best showman. Somebody called him the modern era's Barnum and Bailey. If Steve could have reinvented the circus, he would have done a brilliant job. There was nothing Steve loved more than performing in front of a group. And those presentations even got their own special name. Most of us would talk about giving a keynote address. When Steve was doing it, we'd all call them Steve Notes because he was so good. I remember when we unveiled the Next computer at Symphony Hall in San Francisco, standing room only, thousands of people. Steve holds up a box, and that was the Next computer. And then he holds up a printer and a screen, and he said, and it's all connected with one power cord. And the audience went crazy, screaming applause like you'd give Mick Jagger about a power cord. And that's the kind of pull Steve could have. He could make the ordinary seem fantastic. The greatest showman I ever knew. So let me talk about some of the lessons I learned from working closely with Steve. Let's first talk about Steve's family. Steve was born in 1955, 2 days before my brother was born. And their careers quite did diverge. But he was born to two graduate students. One, his birth mother was a humanities graduate student, and his father, Abdul Fattah Jandali, was a prominent Syrian family, and he was a grad student in the US studying political science and economics. Being struggling graduate students, they immediately put Steve up for adoption, and he was adopted by Paul and Clara Jobs, within days of his being born. I am grateful that abortion was not as common as it is today, because the normal thing for his parents would have been done to abort Steve, and the world would have been a vastly lesser place had they done so. Steve was adopted. I had a normal childhood in Silicon Valley. And in 1968, this kid who is 13 years old wanted a summer job. So he calls the CEO of Hewlett Packard, Bill Hewlett, and says, "Hey, I'd like a job." And Bill Hewlett was so amazed at this bravado of this 13-year-old that he hired Steve. In high school, Steve meets the guy would be his best friend, Steve Wozniak. And Steve would be the marketing genius. Wozniak would be the technology genius behind Apple's early products. They were arrested in 1972 for being phone freaks, for building little blue boxes that could mimic the sound of all the phone signals on the international phone network and make free calls. One of those calls was to the Pope. I believe the legend is that Steve got the Pope on the line via one of these phone free calls. He ends up going to Reed College for 1 year, and he hangs around campus for a while thereafter, taking courses he likes, particularly in areas like design. He goes to India, visits an ashram, tries to find his soul, and comes back, and then calls Nolan Bushnell, the CEO of Atari, and says, "Can I have a job? I love Atari. I love playing games." The answer was yes. But then something weird happened. Nolan Bushnell began getting complaints from fellow workers at Atari that this guy never bathes. He has a kind of pungent odor about him. What do we do? So Bushnell, realizing that Steve was a smart kid, gave him a job, but gave him a job at night when nobody else in the building was around. So very, very early on, you can tell Steve is a little bit different. You see pictures of Abdul Fattah Jandali next to Steve at the top here. You'll see Steve as a young man, Steve in his high school prom, and Steve's father, Paul, with Steve. Steve's father had an amazing influence on Steve. He was an engineer and a craftsman. And I remember this story well. Steve was talking about why even the things that don't seem important are. He says his father used to build wonderful chest of drawers. And his father would beautifully stain the back of the chest of drawers, knowing that the chest of drawers would be stuck up against a wall and never seen. Steve was famous for having beautiful design and even the signatures of his designers on sealed Macintoshes, the first generation of Macintoshes, because he believed that excellence extends across the product, even to packaging. You see Steve's home here. We all talk about great companies being born in garages. Well, this is Steve's garage. In 1976, Steve and Woz launched the Apple I at a homebrew computer show in the Bay Area. People really thought it was a really cool machine, but it was really for hobbyists who wanted to assemble their own computers. The first mass market computer, which you'll see being built off on the left, and then again, a more modern version of it off on top right, is the Apple II. The Apple II was the first mass market PC in existence. Steve had a liaison with a woman who he never married, gave birth to his daughter in 1979. And for the next 6 or 7 years, Steve would refuse to admit paternity. He said he wasn't her father. He wanted no responsibilities, wanted nothing to do with her. But they finally got together in the mid-1980s. Not a good mark for Steve. And as just revenge, his next computer, the Apple III, was a complete failure, a complete disaster, massively eclipsed by IBM's PC. But Steve worked on a comeback, and he was the Time Magazine's Man of the Year in 1982. The Apple II was still very popular for democratizing and opening up personal computing. And in 1983, kind of to make amends, he introduced a high-powered workstation at the bottom here, the Lisa, named after Lisa Jobs. Although he denied it at the time, he ultimately admitted it was named for his daughter, kind of to make nice. So Steve Jobs 2.0, in 1984, the most amazing computer that ever existed was unveiled, in my view, the Macintosh. Had the world's first graphical user interface. It did everything with a mouse. There were no command lines, none of the ugliness of the Microsoft command line interface. And the Macintosh began to become a success. So much so that Apple, Steve had hired John Sculley. John Sculley was the former CEO of Pepsi. And the famous line was, when he recruited John Sculley to be his CEO to manage operations, he said, "Do you want to spend the rest of your life selling sugared water, or do you want to change the world?" And for a while, they made a good team, but Steve was not a good operations manager. And Steve and the board of directors fought constantly, and finally John Sculley launched what Steve thought was a coup to get him tossed out of Apple. Apple did not fire Steve. Apple put Steve in a separate building under a rebel flag and asked Steve to go design whatever he wanted to design, but not to have a role in mainstream operations. Steve quit, and later that year formed Next Computer, which was going to be the revolutionary computer for higher education. This was the beautiful computer off the bottom left. It was all contained. This was the computer that had that one magical power cord. It was very powerful, a workstation on a desk. The problem was that the components were really, really expensive. And even to get a basic Next computer cost between $6,000 and $10,000. And I said to Steve on his advisory board, "This is going to fail. Students can't afford to pay $10,000 for a computer. They can maybe pay, $600 to $1,000. And he said, "But Ron, what they're getting is a BMW for the price of a Yugo." I said, "Steve, it's just not going to work." And unfortunately, well, we sold a bunch of them. It didn't work long term. But the software that ran these computers was truly revolutionary. And for all you developers in the room here, the real breakthrough was something called NextStep, which made the development of object-oriented programs really simple and entirely visual. And that led, along with our operating system, NextStep, that led Apple to buy Next for $400 million in 1995 for the software. The hardware had long since been abandoned. We'd become a software company. So 1985, Steve launches this brand new computer, and in 1995 finally sells the company. Along the way, he became the primary investor in Pixar, and he turned Pixar from being a company that was focused on selling hardware for movies into making movies. And that was Steve's design. And after much searching, Steve finally met his birth mother. And in the process learned he had a half-sister called Mona Simpson. Mona Simpson became a well-known author, and as luck would have it, she married a man named Richard Appel. What was Richard's job? He was the lead writer on The Simpsons. And that was where Steve got one of his early tastes in Hollywood. He married, for real, a woman named Lorene Powell, to whom he was married at the point when he died. And Lorene became a major philanthropist after Steve's death. So 1995, 10 years after buying Pixar, Pixar came out with Toy Story that was such a hit that Pixar IPO'd very successfully. When Steve went back to Apple, when Apple bought Next, Steve became the ICEO, a $1 a year man, not taking a salary, but running Apple and trying to turn Apple around because Apple had been in terrible shape. Steve's first modern Apple product was the iMac, a beautiful all-in-one computer with beautiful pastel cases that became a runaway hit. So the 1980s and early 90s were good to Steve. but he reinvented himself multiple times, leaving Apple, buying Pixar, forming Next, then returning to Apple. So it was a year of pain and a lot of reinvention. And marrying Lorene was a really important thing because it calmed Steve down and began to give Steve something that if you stood on some boxes and turned your head a certain way, you might see a tiny bit of heart. Steve was not the warmest person, very much a rationalist, not the warmest person, but he began to be a little bit more sympathetic to people after he married Lorene. Here you see Mona Simpson's book, A Regular Guy, that's a fictionalized account of her encounter with her brother. Mona is on the top left, and quite recently, and on the right is Steve at his encounter with his sister, and he's holding his daughter Lisa. Lisa, you can see a contemporary picture of Lisa now. She became a best-selling author, among other things, writing a book called Small Fry about life with Dad. So Steve Jobs 3.0, he becomes Apple's real paid CEO in 2000. He establishes the first Apple store, not in Silicon Valley, but right outside Washington, D.C. He launches a brand new way of consuming media, iTunes, in 2003. And then in 2004, cancer strikes Steve. He has pancreatic cancer and has a tumor removed. Now, there are two kinds of pancreatic cancer. 98% of people who get it just simply die, no hope. 2 or 3% you might be able to cure. And luckily, Steve had the kind of pancreatic cancer that is to some degree remediable, maybe. But Steve is ever active. He sells a Pixar to Disney, becomes a board member of Disney. You know, his friends, we all thought that when Steve went to Hollywood with Pixar originally, he was going to get eaten alive because no matter how tough Steve was, the people in Hollywood don't even aspire to having a soul. You know, they're all Harvey Weinsteins, the quintessentially, just quintessentially tough-minded jerks. I'll use, if this weren't a high school audience, I'd be using much stronger words. But Steve beat them at his own game. He beat Disney in the submission around distribution agreements. It was amazing how Steve took on Hollywood and won. The modern Apple was launched in 2007 with the iPhone. That really began Apple's climb into the stratosphere, financially, market-wise, influence-wise. After being beaten up for having a closed system, and Steve loved closed systems because Steve was a control freak. He didn't want users adding anything, changing anything to his beautiful designs. After pressure from users, Steve opened the App Store so normal people could add their own applications. And that became a wild success, a raving success. And if you ask people why they buy iPhones, I bet half of you would say because of the ecosystem. Well, that ecosystem was really founded around the App Store. 2009, Steve's cancer returns, a spread to his liver. He has a liver transplant. But Steve is not one to be stopped by mere mortal diseases. In 2010, after ridiculing Microsoft's tablets, he launches the iPad, which became another runaway success. 2011 was Steve's last keynote. He never spoke in public again, except for the Cupertino Town Council when he gave him the plans for the Apple's new campus, the spaceship campus. That was Steve's last public event. He resigned as CEO, turning things over to Tim Cook, his chief operating officer, in August, and he dies October 5th, 2011. The same month that Steve died, Apple was named, because of its financial performance, not because of Steve, the most valuable technology company in the world. Irony of ironies. You can see Steve's favorite tagline, one more thing. Steve would give one of his Steve Notes, talk about all the great new products with full of hyperbole. This is the world's best. This is so awesome. This is amazing. This is beyond fantastic. And people would think that the meeting was over. And then in front of 2,000 people would say, well, wait a minute. I just got one more thing. And people knew that was the signal for the best that was going to come. He always kept the best surprise for one little more thing. So again, Steve was the world's consummate showman. So what was it like to work with Steve Jobs? Well, what was awesome was he was passionate, charismatic. We used to say Steve could sell sand to Saudi Arabia. He was the world's best sales guy. Steve had a fundamental belief that technology, above all, was democratizing and liberating. And that was the moral impetus behind personal computing for Steve. He hated big organizations. He hated the AT&Ts and the IBMs of the world, unless he was partnering with them. And he loved smaller organizations, more nimble organizations, and organizations that were people-centric. So for him, the personal computer was an act of rebellion. It was something that could democratize lives. The irony is that was true for a while, but today the personal computing and networking is as much a tool of social control as it is of liberation. Steve's aesthetic emphasized radical simplicity. He became a Zen Buddhist and really was into the whole Zen spirit. He loved looking for harmony in nature and the harmony between nature and man. And if there was one gospel Steve adhered to, it was simplicity. If anything was complicated, Steve would scream. For example, when he wanted to get into the phone market with a radical new phone, his original designer showed him a phone with a physical keyboard. And he said, no, that's complicated. That's a mess. I want the phone to be its own keyboard. And his engineers said, Steve, it can't be done. That's never been done. And Steve fought back and said, sorry, anybody who wants us to be on the team will show me a prototype in a month. And it worked. So Steve's vision was, as we used to say, make complex things simple and impossible things possible. He was very generous. He established things like network of cataract clinics for the blind in Africa, but he was very erratic. If you asked Steve for money, he'd probably say no, but if he found a cause to support, he could be very, very generous. Steve was very passionate about what he believed in, and he would fight like cats and dogs, but he was also fact and data driven. If I had a nickel for every time Steve said, I'm going to fire you, I would be in the Bahamas, not here on Zoom today. I remember one time I said, Steve, business people really want us to find a way to make Windows applications usable within our environment. And Steve said, Microsoft is basically a sin. Microsoft is the ugliest creator of technology around. I'll have nothing to do with Microsoft. Their technology is ugly, it's cumbersome, and so forth. But I hired a film crew, went to Chicago and New York, did focus groups, and then brought back to the executive team what users who were paying our bills actually wanted. And Steve caved and turned himself around. He did it many, many times. So he was very fact and data driven. So should you on this call. You can argue many things, but you should never be arguing facts. Steve was great when things didn't go well. When a product flopped, when an intro didn't go well, Steve became self-reflective and entirely self-critical. And we loved that Steve, the Steve who would, who would turn around and say, look, I've messed up. We need to be moving in a different direction. He'd be much more likely to solicit input from other people. That was the good Steve. He also made design thinking, the whole subject of design, important. And he hated bad design. Before Apple, there was no such thing as a mass market for well-designed products. And out of working with Apple came companies like IDEO and others focusing simply on design. I was for a while on the board of directors of a medical device company that was doing something for asthma patients, helping them breathe better. And the CEO says, this asthma device that's going into everybody's homes with kids with asthma, I want it to look just like an iPod. And so, C set the standard. It had to be white plastic. It had to be, had to be shiny. So Steve set the tenor, for lots and lots and lots of design. And today, the hottest career in Silicon Valley are product designers. And this has now become a major art with programs in every major university. So those were the awesome things about Steve. The neutral things were he was a natural rebel. He hated the technology status quo. But the problem was he had no appreciation for what the past had done right. And he would grievously insult even his customers. I remember the head of computing from Cornell University was so excited to meet Steve because Cornell was about to make a major purchase. And Steve said, great to meet you. And the guy says, can I tell you about our environment? And he says, sure. The guy goes up to the blackboard and starts drawing their mainframe environment. And Steve said, you're still using mainframes? You are an idiot. And he walks out the room. And of course, the company lost the sale. He is a countercultural hero, but one who dominated tech culture. He was a no compromise perfectionist. He loved to tell people what they could eat, how they should behave. He was not standoffish. He was not go with the flow in terms of his personal prejudices. While he was a hippie and a rebel and countercultural, he wanted to impose his values on anybody he worked with. I remember in one of our buildings, our headquarters, we had a beautiful floating staircase designed by the genius I.M. Pei. And it looked like it was floating in midair. And our head of HR said, Steve, we need to put elevators in the building for people who can't walk, who can't take stairs. And Steve said, no elevators in my building. We'll have all of our meetings on the first floor, violating the Americans with Disability Acts and everything else. But Steve was a no compromise guy, even on the wrong things. Not so awesome. Things were black or white with Steve. There were no shades of gray. An authoritarian personality and a cult of personality. There were lots of mini Steves at Apple and Next, people who dressed in jeans, black turtlenecks, who wanted to look just like Steve. He was incredibly kind. He could also be incredibly ruthless. I know one executive who had a nervous breakdown who never returned to work after the beating he got from Steve at a staff meeting. His model for negotiation was, I win, you lose. And I want you to demonstrate your pain when I do a contract. I want you to acknowledge I have won and I have taken something from you. He had very bizarre attitudes about the inviolability of the body. I mentioned his pancreatic cancer. Number of physicians believe Steve could have lived if he had intervened earlier than he had. But because he believed the body is a temple, it should not be cut open. Steve got some of those life-saving surgeries probably a little bit too late. And then there was something, pardon my French, but we call that Next and Apple the hero shithead roller coaster. You'd be up one day, the new hero of the company with your new product design. But if you didn't guess where Steve was going with his own view, you could be on the bottom half of that roller coaster. So working for Steve, at least in the 80s and 90s, was an emotional roller coaster. Nevertheless, I would not have traded those years for anything. Steve was the best boss I ever had, the most exciting boss, the most exciting time in my life of doing lots of interesting things. So things we used to say at Next, Hitler was a vegan too. That was a common statement said in closed doors and at staff meetings that Steve wasn't around because Steve was a pretty radical vegan. He would even stop people from ordering meat at dinners he would host at restaurants. And then we worked so darn hard. Steve used to say, the journey is the reward. The journey of getting there is just as valuable as the end. And there was a T-shirt that was created at Next. The gurney is the reward, the hospital gurney, for working so hard. So we all had mixed feelings. But I don't know anybody I knew at Next or at Apple who was really central to the business who would have traded that life for anything else. So we all know the spectacular success of Steve, but success isn't preordained. Now, you can see from the time of Apple's IPO in January 2004 to the time Steve died, what a remarkable success in terms of things like superficial measures like stock price, but this is how the world measures us. 50 times increase in value in 8 years, domination of mobile devices, the most valuable company on earth, the first $1 trillion and now $1.5 trillion company. And those two numbers are separated by merely a couple of months. But success is not preordained. If you look longer term, between 1984 and 2011, you will see lots of peaks and dips. Company really didn't become valuable until after 2004, 2005. It wandered in the wilderness for many, many years. So as Steve said, it takes a long time to build an overnight success. And for those of you who want to build products, or start companies, do software, remember, don't worry if you're not successful immediately. It does take a long time. In the case of Apple, Apple was a pimple on the hide of Microsoft for so many years. Microsoft owned the PC and software market for Apple's really first 20 years. And then eventually Apple succeeded and became the most valuable company, many, many times more valuable than Microsoft. But that took a long time. I call this the terror. Steve managed and worked by walking around. Steve, the most terrifying thing for an engineer would be to walk into an elevator and have Steve follow you and say, "Hey, Tim, what are you working on? Tell me about it." And then Steve would follow you back to your office and he would ask to see your current design. Usually those design reviews, which were never scheduled and you were never prepared for them, would turn into a disaster. Steve could be extraordinarily cruel. At the same time, people were motivated to do better. People wanted to please Steve. Steve used to say, well, okay, but most of these people aren't used to an environment where excellence is expected in everything. And as Steve would say, innovation comes from people meeting up in the hallways or calling each other at 10:30. I used to get midnight calls from Steve with new ideas. So Steve managed not by staying in an office or living in a cubicle. Steve managed by walking around, talking to people, finding out what they were doing, and then commenting and reacting to it. Focus means saying no. It doesn't mean saying yes. As Steve said, I'm as proud of what we don't do as I am of what we do. We used to have an annual planning meeting. We go down to a nice area near San Francisco called Half Moon Bay, take over a hotel, or the whole company would be there and discuss the next year's strategy. And the first day, we'd all put together top 10 lists of things we thought the company should do. We would circulate that, those of us on the senior team would boil those down into a top 10 list for the company. The next morning, Steve would come before us and walk through the top 10 list. And as he did every year, which was always a surprise, he would say, you see these numbers 1 through 10? If you're not working on numbers 1 or 2, you better find a way to, because we're not doing numbers 3 through 10. We're doing the top 2 things that matter. And he was ruthless about focusing on what was important. He was brilliant about figuring out what was important. Steve was not a person, as I said, who much respected the past, including the past of his own products. He used to say that revolutions start with a clean sheet of paper. There are no sacred cows. Steve got rid of the floppy disk drive. He got rid of the DVD CD player. He got rid of so many technologies that Apple had helped bring to market. And sometimes that hurt, like with the next computer using a radical new optical disk drive that cost $100 for the media. And the developer said, Steve, we're not paying $100 just for the media. And that was one of the reasons that the original NeXT computer flopped. We eventually did use a floppy drive, a standard drive. But Steve was always reinventing the next product and killing his last ones. And that's something that true revolutionaries do. If you want incremental design, you're not going to change the world. Steve said, if you ask people what they want, it's a faster, cheaper, smaller version of the last product. That's not how you build a revolution. So Steve was truly a product revolutionary, and he did not mind killing his prior products. He also said that if you are a revolutionary, to succeed, you can't just be a little bit better, because people get comfortable with what they know, and they don't want to change it. But if it's 10 times better, they'll consider changing it. You're not going to give up Facebook for a different social app unless that social app, like an Instagram, is much, much, much better at what it does. So Steve firmly believed that innovation had to be big leaps, big jumps, not small incremental steps, not making something smaller. When he went back to Apple, he found a whole product line of incremental upgrades, slightly faster processors, a little bit more memory, and he canned all of that and reduced the product line to 2 or 3 products. One of my favorite things about Steve that impacted me personally was hiring different. So at a family picnic, we had the Flying Karamazov brothers, which was one of the Bay Area's most impressive and famous comedy troupes of jugglers, jokesters, acrobats. Here you see the Flying Karamazov brothers on the bottom right. And this really hit Steve's a sense of what life was all about. He loved saying, be foolish. When you're young and when you're old, be a bit foolish. He loved what he saw with the Flying Karamazov brothers. That gentleman third from the left with the long blonde braids, that is Randy Nelson. Steve said, Randy, can you teach me to juggle? And he did. He taught Steve how to juggle. Steve said, please come to my office next week. When Randy came to Steve's office, Steve offered Randy the position of head of our software university. You can teach juggling, you can teach how to program. What has Randy Nelson done? Well, he founded and ran Apple University, teaching the best software developers how to build Apple products. Then he went to a small company called Pixar, and he founded and ran Pixar University. What's Pixar University do? It teaches the world's best animators how to make animated films. So Randy, who I don't believe finished college, became an accomplished acrobat and juggler, ended up working at 2 of the world's most admired companies in executive roles. Why? Because Steve was a genius at finding what you were good at and mobilizing your passion and your skills for the greater good, for the greater benefit of the company. That's a picture of me taken right after the Civil War, about 100 years ago. I was a professor of medieval history, also a guy running computer centers. Steve loved the humanities the way only somebody who had never been to college could love a university. And Steve said, please work for me. We're building educational computers. Why don't you run all marketing for higher ed and K-12? And that was my first role. When I left, I was running all of corporate marketing. But Steve took a bet on a medieval historian to run marketing. I can't tell you whether it paid off or not, but it certainly launched my technology career. So lessons. Progress does not move in a straight line. Think different. Really get outside the box. No sacred cows. Let's focus on building something from scratch that's great. Also focus on the small things. Perfection doesn't just extend to everything people see. It extends to packaging. It extends to engineering. It extends to what's in the box, not the box itself. Strive for perfection, hire different, unleash the passions, be 10 times better, and remember that design matters. Just look at what industry Steve disrupted. PCs, tablets, user software, personal communications, the whole cell phone industry, the publishing industry with desktop publishing, movies, how we consume media, and product design. The world in these industries was never the same after Steve Jobs. Steve lives on. There is a statue of Steve in Budapest, the first Steve Jobs statue. And I am a proud participant and was actually critiquing the script for one of America's newest operas, The Revolution of Steve Jobs, that pioneered recently in Santa Fe and is coming to Seattle and San Francisco in a year's time. In the middle is the not so good Steve. This is somebody who worshipped Steve Jobs and wanted to be the next Steve Jobs. Elizabeth Holmes of Theranos, who is probably facing a jail term for fraudulent for building pharmacological technology to do blood transfers and blood analysis that didn't work and imperiled the lives of 800,000 patients. She was caught to be a financial fraudster, but she wanted to be Steve. Same black turtleneck, same jeans, even tried to mimic Steve's voice. So there is a lot that's great about Steve, but simply mirroring his external look and feel doesn't really capture the dynamic passion of Steve for excellence. So live different. There's a good Steve, and that's the Steve I remember. Creative, innovative, a force for change, busting through sacred cows. That's the Steve that I choose to recall.
And so Andy wants to know, when was the first time that you met Steve Jobs?
Probably in the, let's see, the first time I met Steve Jobs was probably in the early 80s. Well, I had arranged for Steve Jobs to meet the governor of Maryland, and hosted and accompanied Steve, driving him from Washington Dulles Airport up into the governor's mansion in Maryland. That was probably my very first time.
Very nice.
He was still at Apple.
All right, you guys, don't be shy. You can put your questions in here. Gosh, that was absolutely incredible. I love so much of what he did. I realized there's a lot of negativity that, you know, surrounded him as well. But
it's mostly now it's all positive.
yeah, exactly.
You know, the evil you did be interred with your bones. May we all remember the good stuff.
Right.
One thing I'd like to highlight is Steve's background. His parents did not go to Harvard or Yale or Stanford. They were very humble people living a lower middle class life in Cupertino, California. Steve was the son of a Syrian immigrant. Steve was an adopted kid. He did not grow up with all the advantages. He did have a loving household and a father who taught him a lot. But Steve changed the world. I'm going to just ask one question of the group. I'm going to go back on share screen one more time for one last slide. Maybe this will provoke some conversation. So who's the GOAT? Who, in your view, is going to be the GOAT? And by that, I mean greatest of all time. On the left, you've got some guy from Cupertino. On the right, you've got an American who was born in South Africa. Who knows who that guy on the right is?
Elon Musk, yeah?
That's Elon Musk. So what's going to be the biggest impact on mankind? Is it going to be going to Mars? Is it going to be building reusable rockets? Is it changing the automotive industry, the battery industry? Is it changing the way we dig tunnels? Is it changing the way we have local as well as interstellar transport? Or is it going to be somebody who democratized computing and put a computer, an iPad, and an iPhone in the hands of billions of people? I don't have a point of view about this, but I wanted to know what you think.
Andy says Steve Jobs by a bit with a smiley face. Gosh, I'm going to go with Steve Jobs too, just because he changed our everyday life so dramatically. Just the iPhone itself was such a life-changing kind of invention that he gave to us. I mean, we have a whole computer at the palm of our hands now, and just the way he imagined everything was incredible.
What do you think about that question? I'm going to answer another question from Brianna. What advice would you give to a young entrepreneur? I could give you two pieces of advice. Really believe in yourself. If you have a good idea, believe in yourself and don't be dissuaded by the many ups and downs. Being an entrepreneur is 99 steps backward, hopefully 100 steps forward. You're going to have many, many disruptions. The second piece of advice is Steve Jobs notwithstanding, it's rare that you're smarter than your customers. So bear hug your customers. Understand what your customers really need. Don't ask them. What we learned at Next and Apple was watch them. Watch what they're trying to do. Don't ask them what they want, but watch what they're trying to do and stay close to your customers. Because being customer driven, particularly in today's environment, there's nothing more important. What was the most impactful conversation I've had with Steve? I can't even count the number of impactful conversations. He had the same conversation with me that he had with John Scully. What do you want out of life? Do you want to help us change the world, or do you want to be a comfortable academic, writing articles for your 100 best friends? And I did not take much persuading. I did not take the kind of persuading that John Scully took. But Steve was good about talking about me as a person. But he was also the best marketing coach I ever had. I never went to business school. I don't have an MBA, but I learned most of what I know about marketing from working with Steve. And many of those, late night, early morning chats about strategy, about what he'd learned, what I'd learned. How did Steve Jobs change my life? Well, he turned me from being a university professor into being a technologist. And my life is radically different. I now get to work with some of the most creative people in the world. And universities are known sometimes as hotbeds of creativity, but sometimes hotbeds of conformity. Get along, go along. And in the technology world, I have met the most interesting people. People like Armando, people that I would never otherwise have met. And my life has been so much richer for it. So Steve transitioned me hardcore full-time into technology.
And thank you for the compliment.
So any more thoughts? Do I have any Elon Musk supporters here?
I'll chime in. I think Elon Musk is going to, Tesla will ultimately affect more lives than the iPhone. I think it is a global shift that will impact the world, especially when you measure it against climate change and the like. I think he started a process that will revamp what civilization is considered to be.
And I am with you, Armando, in that I think Steve impacted daily life in the small devices, small objects, personally. Better music, better computing, better cellular communications, better networking, better ways of talking to each other. Elon Musk thinks at a macro scale, a global scale, where we're going to change the planet. And that Steve wanted to change the planet by democratizing technology. Musk wants to change the planet by changing the planet. Or if he fails, leaving the planet for Mars.
Here you have some more questions.
Toward the end of Steve's life, you aware of any regrets he had about the way he operated his business? I think Steve had regrets about the way he had treated his daughter, Lisa, early on. And that was shown in so many ways. They became inseparable for the last really decade and a half of Steve's life. And I think that was one of his regrets, that he had been such a jerk earlier. When Paul Tsongas, the senator from Minnesota, died, he said, "Nobody ever died wishing they had spent more time in the office." But I think Steve would have regretted not spending so much time in the office. I don't think Steve regretted his work life at all. And so I think it was probably primarily around family, but not work-life balance. It's impossible to think of Steve. I mean, look, a month or two before he dies, he is still giving a keynote speech, the thing he loved to do.
No, I knew Laureen from back in business school. What I remember about that period, kind of their early dating relationship, is that Laureen was a big softening influence on him.
Can you compare the leadership style of Tim Cook to Steve? And obviously Apple's continued being successful under Tim Cook, but sort of compare differences and including which style might be better for Apple today.
So that's a fabulous question. And the stock market analysts have been debating it ever since Steve died. But Steve Jobs was a ruthless authoritarian. It was his way or the highway about things big and small. and decisions often stop with Steve. We used to say, you know, at Next we had 400 direct. He had 400 direct reports. At Apple, you know, he had 50,000 direct reports. He was not an organizational man at all. He didn't believe in organizational hierarchies. And it was through force of personality and force of will that he got what he wanted, and he motivated people by that force of will. You wanted to please Steve. Charismatic leadership. That is not the way to build sustainable organizations. It is great for your first generation, but then you have to seed a much broader second generation of managers. And luckily, Steve hired very, very well. And I think after Steve died, there were more creative energies unleashed in terms of organization, not in terms of technology. Tim Cook is the classic organizational leader. He has a very collegial style. He has a firm point of view, but has a different way of organizing consensus. And I think for organizations that are going to survive, you need some combination of product vision and organizational vision. And I think Cook has the organizational vision in spades. In terms of product vision, that's a big question. People want to know what's been the blockbuster product that Apple has introduced since Steve died. The closest thing is the Apple Watch, which is a good product. It's not a revolutionary product. It was the iPhone, the iPad, the Macintosh that really changed the world. So people want to know, where is the idea going to come from next? And the head of design and products, Johnny Ive, quit about a year ago to go do his own thing. So where is the product vision? We understand that the products that are already in place today will get better and better and better. But is Apple living off of its heritage, or is Apple going to be putting a brand new stake in the ground saying, this is the next wave of X, Y, or Z? The most revolutionary product on Apple's design board that we know about right now, two things. One is the next gen iPhone, which is going to have a radical step forward over years of iteration. And then the integration increasingly of the Mac and the iPad product lines into things that not only look alike and feel alike, but can more operate alike. We know that's coming. But is there a radical something? Is there something, is there going to be the Apple car that was long rumored? What's Apple got next up its sleeve that is truly world changing? And that's what people are hungering for from Apple. Maybe the expectations are too high. Most companies are happy with one breakthrough product. Look at how many decades Oracle has mined its Oracle database. And yes, they bought other products to the market, but they're still an Oracle database company. Apple has done it with the iPhone, with the Mac, with the iPad. So maybe there is one more trick up their sleeve, but that's what the world is hungering for. And that's what Steve was best at. People should feel free to disagree with me.
Well, that's not very much like Steve. That was the part I didn't like much about him, but hire differently, I think, is so important from people to have different backgrounds,
Absolutely.
Knowledge, and there's not ever been anything that I have learned, whether it's a hobby, tennis, singing, or education wise, whether it's school or just, something I'm interested in, like reading about neuroscience, all of it is applicable to, as you said, connecting the dot to creating better things and understanding things more in depth, having a better perspective, I think, all around.
Let me give you just an example of that. If we build products based on the needs and tastes of 28-year-old men in perfect health, all of whom come from a similar Caucasian or Asian background, we would be missing so much about what other people need. You may not know this, but I am almost totally deaf. And the fact that over years, Apple had to build in hearing aid technology into the iPhone made it much more usable. Or for people Armando's age, you don't see as well as you used to. If everybody is 28 years old and in perfect health, you're not going to know that you need all of those accessibility features and better kind of true type text that make text clearer Not every, not everything is going to be at 11, 9 or 11 point type. So by having a diversity of people on the design team, you're going to change the nature of products. Women use products really differently than men do. And as I used to yell at some of my colleagues, it's not about making a pink version of a product. That is not what women want. Women want products that fit into handbags. Women want products that have certain kinds of tactile features because they have smaller hands. It's not about, it's not the superficial stuff. And that's why design teams, and Apple is really good at this, of having a much broader, broader input into its design. But that extends into marketing as well. Again, don't have an ad that's pink to attract women. Talk about how women's lives are lived and how products fit into their lives, not just in the lives of 28-something high-tech executives. So Steve was a believer in diversity of perspectives. And by diversity of perspectives, I really mean diversity, not a bunch of people all saying the same thing that's socially correct, but having disagreements and being different with each other.
So I think we have time for one last question. Any last question?
It looks like Andy has one. What have you learned from cooperating with Steve Jobs?
About cooperating with Steve?
Mm-hmm.
For me, as just my survival skill was facts and data count. That if you talk to Steve because you had an opinion, if Steve heard you say, well, I feel, he'd blow you out of the water. I don't care how you feel. Do you have facts to suggest that there's a market for this? Do you have facts to suggest that this is going to work better than that way? You're criticizing this. On what basis are you criticizing it? Get me some facts and I'll listen to you. So when I think about my debates and my getting my work done with Steve, it was all about, being best informed and really having a whole field, a whole market. One of the things I did was I led all the vertical markets, education, healthcare, law, finance, and I really got to learn those markets well. So when I spoke, I had market wisdom from talking to people in the market. I said, be close to customers. So, be customer driven, be fact-based. Steve, he never said do those things, but that was my survival skill that's carried me well into the present.
Very nice. Well, thank you again so much. You guys, your reaction buttons are there at the bottom. If you guys can all just give him a hand. That was absolutely inspiring and amazing and just so full of useful information for these young entrepreneurs.
Well,
So,
this was a real pleasure. And I wish you all I hope you all do great things in the future. I'm so delighted that there was this interest and best of luck in all things.
likewise. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
My pleasure.
Take care. Talk to you soon.
A real round of applause.
And Alicia, thank you very much for doing this and for being nice enough to include me in today's program.
No, oh my gosh, we are honored to have you here and so grateful. I mean, the wisdom, advice, everything that you've given is just, it's so invaluable. Thank you.